Today I'm going to be reviewing James Baldwin's debut novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Now, this novel... Okay, let me start over. I was introduced to James Baldwin recently by one of my professors who had us read a short story of his called Sonny's Blues. And I had never heard of James Baldwin before. And I didn't know that he was an established, literary figure. And it was really interesting. The story Sonny's Blues is a beautiful story, and it exhibits a lot of what makes James Baldwin awesome. And so, after I was introduced, the professor mentioned that he wished he had time in the class to teach the novel Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is James Baldwin's first novel, and arguably his most famous. So I went to the local bookstore, I picked up a copy, and then while I was there I noticed kind of a used copy of the collection of stories Going to Meet the Man, which contains Sonny's Blues. So I bought that as well so that I could have a copy of that story, and I read that first, and I'm going to do a review video for it at some point. And those short stories were amazing, and so I was really excited to finally get to Go Tell It on the Mountain, but also a little scared, because after doing some research on James Baldwin's life, he seemed like the kind of guy that I would really want to like. But this story has to deal with a young man over the course of his birthday in New York. I don't know exactly when, but I know I think it's during the 50s or maybe even the 40s possibly, but it's still relatively early in the century and before, the civil rights movement. And just so you know, James Baldwin is a African American, and so his characters are African American. They live in Harlem, and essentially it follows this boy who is the stepson of a local minister on his birthday, from when he wakes up to the evening and the morning the next day. And essentially it's this really beautiful story about him coming to terms on his 14th birthday with his identity, who he is, his belief in God, his sexuality, his relationship with his father, because essentially he's the oldest son in the family, but he is the stepson to the minister, and the rest of the children are his natural-born children. So he kind of treats him poorly, to say the least. And what's really interesting about this novel is the way it's split up. It's split into sections, and it starts with the 7th day, which is the beginning of the story, the beginning of John, the main character's day. And he kind of goes throughout most of the day, and kind of gives you an idea of how his relationship is with his mother and his siblings and his brother. And he goes out on the town a little bit and spends some time in the town, and it gives you an idea of his life. And then later in the day he goes to church to prepare and clean the church for a service that evening, and it's on a Saturday. And then once he's in the church and the service starts, it's split into a section called Part 2, The Prayers of the Saints. And the saints are essentially the members of the church, but there are 3 prayers that we go through. And it's Florence's prayer, who is his aunt and the sister of his father, Gabriel. And it essentially goes back, and while she's praying, tells you her story about how she got to where she is, and it examines her relationship with God and her relationship with her brother and their mother. And it's very interesting because it reveals a lot about the world that made John and that influences John now that he doesn't know about. And it also, I'll get to why this is really good, and also for another reason. And then the second prayer we have is Gabriel's prayer. which is probably the most compelling part of the book. And that is John's stepfather, and it gives you, again, his history. It kind of starts almost where Florence's prayer left off, at least with him, because she moves away and leaves her brother, so his story picks up where hers left him. And it moves forward and gives you more of a story about him and why he is the way he is. And that is extremely interesting. And it fleshes out the character, both psychologically, because you move into their thoughts and their feelings. And it gives you a lot of history that John also doesn't know about how Gabriel got to be the way he is. And it also reveals his goodness and his deep flaws. The third prayer we have is Elizabeth's prayer, which is John's mother. And that pretty much picks up from where she met Gabriel and how she became pregnant with John and her story. And that is also an excellent section, and it ends pretty much with where they're at now. And then it moves into the third part of the book called The Threshing Floor, where John, all the action moves back to the present, and John starts to have a religious experience and at the church during the service. And that is the last section of the book, where it's his feelings about going through and discovering God. And that's the most abstract part of the book and the most metaphorical. Now, besides the interesting way that it's written, James Baldwin, at least in this novel, has one of the most beautiful and compelling writing styles I've read. He writes with such conviction that his analysis and observations feel so right and so clear. He both gives you something that's entertaining and almost lyrical in the way that it's written, and it reads very nicely and beautiful, but also it cuts right to the psychological, like, marrow of these characters. You know how they tick, and he doesn't have to, he shows you, and you know these characters inside and out. They are fully fleshed out, real people, and I think he based a lot on stuff that happened to him in his life, but they are dynamic, and really it's astounding. It's beautiful, but at the same time angry, without being bitter. It addresses a lot of the topics like racial discrimination and all sorts of things of that era, and it is, I mean, it's just impressive, his writing style, how beautiful it is, and how precise, and just how deep he goes, and I mean, it's like, wow, this guy really knew people, he knew the characters, he observed, he understood, and he can put on the page the feelings and make you feel them and make you understand, even if you don't agree. It was a pleasure to read from start to finish, and I'm blown away. Just amazed. It's a brilliant novel. And I have his second novel, Giovanni's Room, which I will be reading soon after I finish my Summer of John Green. And I'm even more excited to read that because it's so different. And I really want to read more and more James Baldwin, because I don't know how I've never heard of James Baldwin before, and I feel a little upset that, and robbed really, that I wasn't introduced to him before, because the man can write, and is quickly becoming a favorite writer of mine. And just because it's a voice that is good for diversity. You know, a lot of the classics are old white dudes, and I've read a lot of old white dudes. I've read a lot of not old white dudes. I've read a lot of, you know, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Bradbury. You know, Tim O'Brien's a white dude. Just, I mean, littered. My shelves are littered with white dudes. So it's good to have an African American man who also happened to be homosexual, and that doesn't come up. I mean, there's some, I think, undertones, if I understood correctly, in the book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, but never comes like a major plot point. But Giovanni's Room, it is a major plot point. And at the time when he wrote it, I believe in the 1950s, I believe he was encouraged not to publish that story. But he felt it was important to have a voice, and I find that really commendable. Whether or not you agree with that or not is fine, but it's good to understand things and have knowledge of them and perspective, regardless of your belief. So it's important to celebrate authors who bring a diverse picture and will give a larger perspective to anybody's world experience. So I highly suggest Go Tell It on the Mountain. Even if, his second novel doesn't appeal to you, I would pick this up. It's beautiful, it's sharp, it's poignant, it's a very interesting story, and historically gives some nice perspective, and the language is beautiful. His writing is beautiful. I can't say it enough. Go get you some James Baldwin. Enjoy it.